Hello, everyone. My name is Mamor Hussein. I'm a cognitive science undergrad at Rutgers University. And so I've put together various amounts of presentations on not just cognitive science, but neuroscience specifically, which is the field that I will be, uh, majoring in. And so to not only further my own knowledge, but to further the knowledge of other people that, want to understand the very basics of neuroscience, psychology, biopsychology, neuropsychology. It's a beautiful field to delve into because once you, step your foot into this field, you want to only learn more and more. And so that's exactly what happened within the pandemic. I figured out, wow, like I love the brain. It is a beautiful, not just organ, but it's this fatty substance within our skulls that, comprises us and who we are. It collects signals, and cognitive science is really the interdisciplinary study of the mind as a processor. Dr. Rhodes talks about this in one of his lectures as well. And so it's a beautiful subject to go into, but I will share my screen and I will just introduce a small presentation I have on neuroscience, the very basics that you need to know, and it will go from there. Now, let me share it. And okay, I'm going to present. Beautiful. Okay, so neuroscience 101 in 15 minutes or less. So I will try my best to keep up, and I'll try my best to go as fast as I can so I don't bore anyone. Now, you can probably see my mouse, but right here is the synaptic terminals. I didn't want to do that. How do I annotate? Darn it. Okay. Whatever. Okay. So the very basic unit of structure that you need to know, the first level of understanding comes from the neuron, which comprises what neuroscience is the study of. It's the study of the brain and the brain as a science, right? So starting off with the very basic, the nucleus of a neuron is within the cell body, pictured right here. So there's the nucleus containing the DNA information, okay? There's the specification of a neuron is that it isn't like any other ordinary cell. It is consistently making branches, these dendrites, right? And these become dendritic branches, which then span off into other cell bodies and other cells via the axon, right? The axon carries information from the cell body received by some sort of stimulus, and then it travels along the length of the axon at incredible speeds down to the synaptic terminals, right? These are telodendria. These are the receiving ends, I believe. So the dendritic branches span off. They collect signals. They collect signals chemically, right? And then that chemical is converted into an electrical impulse, which is carried up the dendrite and into the cell body, out of the cell body via the axon hillock or whatever, and down into the axon and into another cell. This is very simple computation. And the thing about neurons is that they are binary. They are either so you can't say something on the sort of it was a strong impulse or it was a weak impulse. It is an impulse or there is not an impulse. So there's that binary nature of neurons, right? Either they have an electrical signal or they don't. You can't say that it was a weak stimulus. No, it is a stimulus or it is not. There is a chemical or an electrical signal within the neuron, or there is not. It's very simple. So from the dendrite, it receives these chemical signals via neurotransmitters, which are chemical substances, which define certain things. For example, dopamine, it's an excitatory neurotransmitter. It is not inhibitory, such as serotonin might be, or such as GABA might be, right? GABA is one of the strongest inhibitory neurotransmitters within the brain. Now, moving on, the cell body. So we've covered the dendrite, right? It's the receiving end of the neuron, right? It has branches, okay? And it receives chemical signals, and then those chemical signals are converted into electrical signals, and it goes into the cell body. Now, moving on, the cell body integrates the electrical activity, and it generates a nerve impulse, which then travels off via the axon, right? The axon is this railway system for all out of all cell bodies of neurons, okay? Now, the third thing we move on to is the axon itself. The axon is the transmission portion of a nerve, okay? And it transmits a nerve impulse, moves from neuron A down to neuron B via teledendria into synaptic terminals, right? This will become known as the presynaptic neuron, postsynaptic neurons, right? So postsynaptic neurons, receiving ends will be the dendrites. The transmission ends will be the axons, right? The axon and the synaptic terminals of these axons, right? Okay, moving on. You then have the terminals, right? This is the fourth part of a neuron, right? Essential to its activity. This converts the impulse to chemical signals to pass on signals to other neurons, right? There's neuron A right here, and for example, neuron B right here. This is the axon hillock of this neuron cell body, and you can tell that this is connected to this via these synaptic terminals, which are secreting these neurotransmitters, which cause a chemical reaction, resulting chemical to an electrical impulse in this cell or not. Then again, it's all binary. This is a different type of image, but I think it shows the branching off of these neurons very well. So these are called myelin sheath. These are, you can say, the insulators of an axon and help the axon travel extremely fast. And this is for extremely high cognitive processing in the brain. And it's only in areas where high cognitive processing is required and higher thinking is required. This is the only areas in which these types of cells are in. Moving on. So the neuron has action potential, okay? It has a stimulus, it has depolarization, it has an action potential, and then it has repolarization, a refractory period, or it's referred to as the hyperpolarization, and then it has a depolarizing state, which is the resting state as well. So you can tell how quickly this action potential is occurring. So the voltage, the y-axis is in voltage millivolts. So resting membrane potential is around -70 millivolts, right? The action potential threshold that must be crossed in order for an action potential to occur has to be -55 millivolts. If it isn't -55 millivolts, it will be a failed initiation, as it says here, right? So there's a stimulus. If the stimulus is not strong enough upon this neuron, it will not activate all of the nerve. It won't be a nerve impulse. There will not be an impulse whatsoever. It'll be a failed impulse. Okay, let's say you give it a stimulus of -60, for example, right? It must cross the -55 millivolts, -60 to -55 millivolts on average, in order for there to be an action potential. And then there's a surge up to 40 millivolts of, electrical impulse. Then it goes back down and it has a repolarizing. And the refractory period is in a state in which there cannot be another potentiation of the same neuron, right? So there is a refractory period, a period in which there's not going to be another impulse, right? It is not possible. After it reaches after it depolarizes and it is completely stable and at resting membrane potential again, then it can have another action potential, right? Despite it being from start to finish only about 4 to 5 milliseconds, when you need, for example, when you have a constant stimulus, for example, it will be neurons that are continuously firing that don't have these refractory periods, right? And so you see this in things such as something that keeps on getting brighter and brighter, or something that keeps on getting louder and louder, or for example, a pain that keeps on getting sharper and sharper. So the refractory period is for certain neurons, right? But when you have these don't have refractory period, you get these neurons that don't have that refractory period, right? So the next thing is, what is a neurotransmitter? I talked about it before. So a neurotransmitter is practically a chemical substance. It's released from the presynaptic neuron. It's then absorbed by the neurotransmitter receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, right? It's pictured right here. This is the postsynaptic neuron. The neuron, in order to carry nerve impulses, it then, an easy way to explain this. For example, let's say you have dopamine coming out from the presynaptic neuron, right? It's a vesicle. These are carried in vesicles. There's a distinction that should be made. These neurotransmitters are not just flowing like, some liquid. They are in a vesicle, which carries them out. The vesicle opens up once it gets to the presynaptic neuron. Then when this happens, they get released into this synapse. Synapse is the gap in between the presynaptic and the postsynaptic neuron, right? Once the dopamine, for example, reaches here, there are dopamine receptors, right? Or serotonin receptors or GABA receptors, right? That take and bind this neurotransmitter into the postsynaptic neuron. And then that gets carried out into a transmission after the neurotransmitter and the chemical, whatever that neurotransmitter might be, gets taken in by these receptors, right? So there's so many examples of neurotransmitters, right? I also added types of different neurons. So there's bipolar neurons, unipolar neurons, multipolar neurons. The stereotypical neuron will be the multipolar neuron, where there's one neuron branching off into thousands of dendrites, a single axon, which then branches off into teledendrites and the synaptic terminals. Now, GABA is inhibitory. Serotonin is excitatory. Dopamine is excitatory. It's required for example, some Alzheimer's patients are given dopamine, right? You then have pleasure, which is also dopamine is also in charge of it. There's also oxytocin and vasopressin. Those are other neurotransmitters that are also huge role players. For example, oxytocin is released in women who are giving labor, and it is continuously released and causes harder and harder contractions of the muscles. And that's that. Glutamate is also an excitatory. It's one of the most common excitatory neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine, it is essential for proper muscular function. You then have parts of the brain. Now, I'm trying to keep this under 15 minutes. I believe I don't want to go over. However, you have parts of the brain. You have the cerebral cortex, you have the cerebrum, you have the corpus callosum, you have the thalamus, hypothalamus, you have all of these. But the four main distinctions that are to be made, is starting from the front, is the forebrain, you have the midbrain, you have the hindbrain, and you have the brainstem. The most essential that need to be known here is the for example, the what are they called? This isn't pictured in here actually. Oh, the hippocampus, which actually is not pictured here, but the hippocampus is the area of the brain where memory formation and memory retrieval is also essential. These are essential parts of the brain, right? You have the cerebral cortex, which is the outer layer, the outer crown of the brain, which stores things, for example, such as memory. Hippocampus, you could say, is the packaging hall and the memory hall and the formation hall of memories. And so once those things are packed up, they are sent into long-term potentiation, long-term storage. And when those memories need to be retrieved, you can retrieve them either consciously or unconsciously. For example, you smell something. For example, you smell something that reminds you of something when you were a kid. Or for example, you see something that reminds you of your dad. Or you hear something, right? Or you interact with someone and it reminds you of something. It's these reminders, and those reminders are retrieved from the outer crown of the brain in the cerebral cortex. Now, the cerebellum is also another essential. Cerebellum, pons, and medulla. These are the, instead of the hindbrain, I would call this the involuntary control center of humans. For example, things such as breathing. We don't have to necessarily think to breathe when we go to sleep, right? So the hindbrain will take control of this, right? The cerebellum is essential. It is essential in for example, motor coordination. For example, you put one foot front, you know that you already need to put the other foot in front of you. So when you go on a run, you don't have to necessarily think about running. You just do it, right? And so the cerebellum stabilizes any sort of motor coordination imbalances. You then have the tegmentum, right? Tegmentum is also where I would say the pleasure center of the brain is. You have it's a very complex system, but I'm not going to dive too deep into it. Then you have the pituitary gland, very essential for hormonal releases. There's the anterior pituitary, there's the posterior pituitary. Posterior pituitary producing about 2 hormones, oxytocin and vasopressin. Anterior pituitary producing about 5, I believe. So there's 7 in total that are produced within this tiny gland. Very essential. And within, there's a sinus in the skull that is specifically designed for the pituitary gland. I think that's very interesting. Now let's move on. Now, the effect of stress on the brain. I think that I will skip this for now because it will become a very long video otherwise. Some mental illnesses, horrible picture. I apologize for it. But right in front of me, I have the DSM-5. So the mental illnesses, where do I even start with mental illnesses? Mental illnesses change the way your brain and your neurons make connections. That is the simplest way I can put it. So you really, by a mental illness, you are changed biologically and to the neurological level. You are different when you have a mental illness, not in necessarily good ways, not necessarily always in bad ways. There's give and take, but mental illnesses are psychopathologies of your brain, not just your brain, but of your psyche. Right? They are psychopathologies, illnesses of the psyche. And I believe that what more to be said is stressors, as I said before, stressors are a huge contributor. They really are. Stressors are a huge contributor to these things. Other things that are contributors to mental illnesses can be PTSD. They can be alcohol disorder. They can be postpartum depression. There can be different types of causes for every single type of mental illness, right? And so in abnormal psychology, if anyone takes it at Rutgers or wherever you take it, in abnormal psychology, you learn that when you are sad, for example, right? When you are sad or depressed or down or anxious, it is your body, it is your psyche, it is your mental state telling you that something is wrong, something is not right. And you don't need to suppress them by saying, think happy thoughts. No, it's okay to be sad. It is okay to be depressed or anxious. These are normal human biological emotions, and there's nothing wrong with them. So with that, I end the video, and I very much appreciate anyone who watched. If you have any questions, you can email at mamorh@gmail.com. Thank you.